All right, welcome to our Modern Change Academy for July. It's great to see all of you. Hopefully, some returners, some new folks. This month, we have a topic on managing compliance in regulated industries with change and release. So, we're going to kind of talk about how you can do that with ServiceNow and do a demo, give some examples. From a housekeeping standpoint, we love to make these sessions really engaging. So we definitely have time at the end for Q&A, but we encourage you throughout the session to ask Q&A questions. We'll flag a lot of those for answering live. We also love if you want to raise your hand, if you want to answer your question directly, please do that, and we'll just probably pause throughout wherever we are and allow you to come off mute and ask those questions. This presentation is going to be recorded and is posted on our community and YouTube about a week after. So if you want to share it with any colleagues, you can do that. And after after this event, please stay on for a little bit and fill out a survey that will pop up after you close the Zoom meeting. Another thing that you've likely seen before is a safe harbor notice. So there may be some forward-looking things that we talk about in this presentation. Those are really based on our best judgments and information that we have at this time. But don't take any of those things as set in stone. Those can change, likely will change. All right, let's do some speaker intros. I'll start since I'm already talking. My name is Kalen Castelo. I'm one of the outbound product managers within ITSM, primarily focusing on change. I'm happy to be here. Joe, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, Joe Offenberg. I'm an outbound product manager as well, and I focus on change and release management. Specifically, a couple of the products we'll be talking about today, digital product release and DevOps Change Velocity. Nice to see everybody here.
Hey everyone,
Excellent. Oh,
Greg Holibus, another outbound product manager in ITSM. I focus primarily on release, and I run a lot of these events and programs that hopefully you all have been a part of.
all right. And then here's just a quick slide advertising our Live on ServiceNow event series. That is what this Modern Change Academy is a part of. We have other series on a lot of topics relevant to ServiceNow. So if you like this kind of stuff, there's a lot more out there. So you can scan this QR code to see the schedule and kind of sign up for what makes sense for you. Okay, from an agenda standpoint, just three broad topics or kind of areas that we're going to cover today. The first is going to give you a quick overview and relationship between DevOps Change Velocity and digital product release. And we're going to talk about those in the context of how you can help, how they can help you manage compliance. Then we're going to talk about industry regulations and standards with a specific focus on DORA. And then finally, we're going to have a demo for most of this session. Like I said, we'd love that to be pretty interactive. So please raise any questions, raise your hand if you want to speak, and we'll make sure you have an opportunity to. I already see someone raising their hand, so let's help you speak. So Bill, you're allowed to talk. If you want to ask your question, go ahead. Or are you just testing how to raise your hand? You can unmute if you are able. Okay, maybe not. Maybe Bill's just testing it out. If he changes his mind, you can come off mute. All right, so before we jump into this, though, we're going to have a few polls. So here's the first, and let me kickstart it. Okay, so just 60 seconds to respond to these two questions. One is, does your organization utilize change to enforce compliance today? Is it yes, you do it for both from a governance standpoint as well as for record keeping? Or maybe you just use it for record keeping today? No, or you're unsure. And then the second part of this question here is a short answer is, what are the regulations that your organization faces today that change or release is relevant to?
Yeah, and just the distinction is that are you just doing record keeping with change management, or are you actually using it to enforce policies? Is those first two answers there.
And I'll share. So it looks like the vast majority of folks are using ServiceNow for managing compliance in some manner. It seems like most are actually using it for both governance enforcement as well as record keeping, which makes sense. and others are only using it for record keeping. So good to see. One more set of poll questions. Stop sharing this. Watch the second poll. Okay. So how do you document evidence to comply with regulations today? As we saw, a lot probably do that in ServiceNow, but do you also use ServiceNow in other systems? Do you do it primarily out of ServiceNow if you don't use ServiceNow? Maybe you don't do it well, and when audits happen, it's really difficult. It's a fire drill, or maybe you're not sure. If you don't use ServiceNow or use another system with ServiceNow, it'd be great if we could understand where that is. And then the last question is, do you see value in having a way to link or store compliance artifacts as a part of a release? So it looks like about 80% of folks use ServiceNow in some way, whether just ServiceNow or ServiceNow and other things. 6% are outside of ServiceNow, and a few struggle with this pretty starkly. So hopefully, as we go through the demo today, you'll learn about some other ways that you can help manage some of these compliance artifacts with some of the capabilities that we have within change and release. And then just going to question 3 there, it seems like most folks see there's a lot of value in having these artifacts stored as a part of release, and that's something that we're looking to do more readily as a part of our backlog. So really good information to see.
Kaylin,
Okay.
I would think that there are some customers who do use ServiceNow and also struggle. Probably not too many, but
Yeah.
maybe that's a flaw in the poll we can address next time.
Yep, definitely.
Yeah.
All right, Joe, I'll hand it over to you to share and go through the overview.
Galen, real quick, actually, and Joe, before you take over, we have a question. Could you flash the first poll question up again? Someone wants to ask their organization and wants to take a quick screenshot.
I'll hand it over to you, Joe.
Great. So before we get into the policy and compliance part, I thought it'd be good to understand the underlying technology that we're talking about here. I think most of you have been on these webinars before, and we have done webinars specifically on DevOps Change Velocity and specifically on our digital product release. But just an overview. So DevOps Change Velocity is probably our first endeavor into this world. We built this about 6 years ago, actually. So 2019 or so is when we first started working with customers on solving this problem, where you had autonomous application teams outside of the IT organization. They were adopting DevOps, and they wanted to deploy things to production in a more agile way, which means they're making smaller incremental changes continuously through DevOps pipelines. And if you know a lot about change management, the history of it, it wasn't really built for that kind of scenario. You have many reviews, and it's a very arduous process. You might even have a change approval board, a CAB that meets every couple of weeks or so. And so it really wasn't very DevOps friendly. So we built this solution to solve that problem. And what it does, it takes data from all of the various DevOps tools in different domains. So you have your orchestration tools like Jenkins or GitHub Actions or ADO pipelines. You have your planning tools like Jira, ADO boards, and Rally, and so on. And of course, our own SPM Agile solution. And then you also have a lot of pipeline tools like Jenkins and GitHub Actions and so on. And what we did was we created a solution that could bring data in from all of these tools. And at the appropriate time, you'd hit like a production deployment, or another pipeline. Some pipelines will build your application, test your application, and then deploy. And then when you deploy, you needed a change record. So we would have all the necessary information in the platform. We would create a very comprehensive change record, and I'll show you examples of this. And then the data that made up that change record would include data points that are actually required to prove compliance with certain policies and certain regulations, right? And that's the case. The change record would become the evidence you need because all that data would be attached. Now, furthermore, we could also automatically approve changes. One thing we learned very quickly is that once you attach your DevOps pipelines to ServiceNow, is you'll get a lot more changes. The volume of changes go up. The changes are smaller, more incremental, but the volume increases, right? You'll get a lot of changes. Sometimes from the same application, you can get multiple changes a day even, and if you're deploying that frequently. And then, so we had to be able to approve those changes in an automated way. And the way we do that is with change approval policies. And those change approval policies then can enforce these regulatory requirements of certain applications. If they're customer facing, if they have customer data in it, if they're in certain geographical regions, they're going to have certain types of requirements for that. And then, of course, all the data we need to make this work, we can provide that data on a dashboard, including the DORA metrics. Now, the DORA metrics that this DORA is referring to is DevOps Research and Analytics. That's historically what we've called the metrics that we look at to see how DevOps teams are doing, not the regulatory requirements coming out of Europe, which is also called DORA. So I apologize for the confusion there, but we didn't create the acronyms. Different people, different bodies across the world created these acronyms. I think the original DORA team came out of a project at Google where they wanted to measure, the efficiency of DevOps teams, and now the digital operations resilience and so on. That's the new regulatory requirements out of Europe. Same acronym, two completely different things. Okay. The other product we're talking about today that helps with this is our new product came out last year, digital product release. And what we are attempting to do here is solve a problem that we partially created with DevOps Change Velocity, in that now that we had a mechanism for creating changes and approving changes in an automatic way, what tend to happen is an overloading of policy in the change process. And if we look at these policies, many of them were actually things that really should be about release and not about change, okay? So how do we differentiate the two? Well, I'll talk about that on the next slide, but specifically digital product release is about ensuring the release readiness of a version of a product. So you're going to have different phases where you do that. And in each phase, you're going to have tasks and policies to ensure that what you're doing in that phase is complete and compliant, right? Complete and compliance. That's what we look for each phase of a release. And if you look at things like during the development process, you might look at code coverage, you might look at unit testing, functional testing, security scans. All of that should be happening in the release process. But in order to prove it as evidence, many of our customers were putting these data points in the change record as well, and because they didn't have a formal release process. But now that we have this product, we would expect a lot of that to shift. Okay, so that means data points that are really focused on the specific version of a release and whether that met the criteria for release readiness, including whether it met the criteria for a governance or compliance requirement, or just to ensure that we meet a certain standard. That should be in the release process, and we'll talk about that. All right. So this is kind of where we draw the line. Change policies, I'm going to start with this one on the right here. Will the change have a negative impact on a configuration item? This is really what historically change management has always been about. You have your CMDB, you have your CIs, you have application services. If a change is impacting the availability of a service, then we're going to have to review it to ensure that it doesn't, right? That it doesn't negatively impact a service. It doesn't create an outage, it doesn't create incidents, and so on. That's the focus of change management. Release policies are really about, like I just said, the new version. You have a new version of a product or service, and you want to make sure that those policies, those new versions meet some criteria. The testing results are within a certain range, the regression testing, functional testing. You're not negatively impacting the performance of an application and so on. You have a lot of tools out there in the pipelines today that do things like quality scans. It's very common to use a Sonar Cube for that, or security scans like Veracode or checkmarks and so on. Those are the kind of things we want to shift over from the change policy into the release, right? Because even if you never deploy something and you don't get a change record, because that happens, you'll create a new version of a product, and you might not deploy that version. You might go and start over and create the next version of the product, and that's the one that actually gets deployed. And that's where, we're going to need a change record is when you deploy it. But we want to ensure that every version of every product, follows all the required testing and, just to ensure compliance with all of the quality and so on that's required. Okay. I'll pause here and see if there's any questions we need to address at this time.
Yeah, we have a few. The first, I'm going to go with the individual that rose their hand. I think it's Zavil. I'm allowing you to talk if you want to come off mute and ask your question. Oh, maybe there's your question in chat. Sometimes it seems like the mute works or doesn't work. Okay. Well, I see their question. So Zavil's question is, hey, ServiceNow team, when is the new version of DPR released in August?
Yeah, so I believe that's going to be version 2.2 that's coming in August. And
That's right.
yeah, so digital product release is a store application. Every quarter we have a new version. And it's because it's a new module in ServiceNow, the capabilities in each version could be really significant, from one to the next. So in August we have a release that's going to be we're going to start focusing on some new capabilities. We could talk about the roadmap at the end, but the idea is that we are going to start adding some capabilities around complex rollouts, and that should also help with the topic we have today, compliance and so on. Yeah.
Okay. Second question I see is from Manny. He's asking a question about DevOps. Today they have a legacy process built on Service Catalog integrating with change in ADO. They trigger their deployments automatically once the change is approved and the start time is reached. Can you do the same thing with DevOps Change Velocity?
So DevOps change velocity is not really about triggering deployments. It's more about when the deployments are triggered and however they're triggered. It's usually triggered by things happening in development, right? Application teams committing code to a Git repository, and then at the end of the day, they do a build, and then the build is successful, and that will trigger a deployment. That's traditional, what some folks would call continuous delivery or continuous deployment. Even is to bring it to the next level and take it. So that happens outside of ServiceNow. But when it does happen, ServiceNow needs to create the change. Now, what we can do is we can use the change record as a mechanism to hold up that deployment or to wait for the approval, and the approval will take into account, various change policies as you see here. Yeah. Digital product release, on the other hand, next year we will be focusing more on automation and that capability to actually trigger deployments from a release process. We do expect that capability to be available next year within DPR.
Another related DCB question, and we can answer this one probably quickly, is there a way to transfer approvals housed within other repositories like GitHub into ServiceNow?
Yeah, that's something I can show you an example of. So what we do in, for example, ADO, right? Within DevOps Change Velocity, we could bring in, for example, pull requests, and a pull request has to be approved. That pull request approval state can be one of the line items for the actual deployment of a change, for example. To get other approvals, like from ADO, there are approvals. There's also something in GitHub called approval gates for environments. All of that data is available for DevOps Change. In some cases, we may have to actually make a subsequent call to the tool to get the results of that approval or to get the status of that approval because we don't have a native record that shadows the approval record in GitHub. But it's not difficult to achieve if that's what you're looking for.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then last question I'll do, because just to be cognizant of time, I'm gonna bring Steve. Steve, if you want to come off mute and ask your question, otherwise we'll keep chugging forward. Okay, it seems like maybe this unmute feature doesn't work. So if you can, just funnel your questions into the Q&A, and we're going to work from that. All right, Joe, just keep going. Go ahead.
Sure. Okay, so just to be clear, that release policies again are about the readiness of a release, and change policies are about making sure the impact to production is limited. Okay, so this is a slide that we we had we last I guess it was October or November, we had a seminar, CSDM for DPR. And I think one of the most important things about that seminar, it really broke down the data model and the schema that we're using, and uh, also the just the importance of the delineation in the common services data model between the logical representation of applications in the build part of that model and the running managed services, your traditional CMDB CIs in the running part of the model. So when we create a business application, it doesn't actually represent what's running in your data center or I mean, it's a logical representation of it, but it's not where you're going to like open up your tickets and so on, your change tickets and so on. What we use it for is to understand the application modeling and to understand new versions of products that get applied to that. So every time you create a new version of a product and you go through the release product process to create a new digital product version, that's going to be tracked on the build part of the model. That's the representation you see here. When you deploy that to production, actually deploy that version to an app service, for example, you need a change record. And so the change record then becomes what, essentially a marriage between the digital product version and the app service. Okay, so that's just one thing I want to call out. And then this slide, I think, really represents that as well. So this is the example, this is an example of that. Okay. Okay, let's talk about industry regulations and standards, because this is what we want to do is talk about the capability in the products for tracking this and how you could actually apply them to real policies and real things. So pretty much every industry has regulatory requirements that enforce things like customer privacy and general data protection and security and integrity of the record systems itself. And there's various and in different geographical regions, or even if you're not located in that region, like you have a company that headquartered in New York, but you're trying to sell stuff in California, you're going to be subjected to their local regulations, which is the CCPA, California Consumer Protection Act, right? So that's going to be applied there. And this applies also to global regulations like GDPR, for example. We have to prove in GDPR that we are respecting customers' data and making sure it's private. And so we have to be able to prove that in our pipelines that we're actually testing for that kind of thing. And DORA is the same way. DORA is about operational resilience, right? So we have to prove that we're testing things, we're doing penetration tests, we're doing security scans, we're making sure that backups are being created and enforced. But DORA actually goes a step further. It specifically calls out the accountability when third parties are involved. So you outsource your operations to a partner, like a system integrator or something, and then you have to prove that they're doing what they're saying they're doing. So a lot of what you see are like technology providers, having to prove that to their clients, so their clients can prove it to the regulators, right? So you have this whole chain of compliance and accountability that has to be tracked. Now, one thing that's pretty common to all the industries are things like DORA. So, and here's the other thing. Here's the other reason why I'm focusing on DORA. When that regulation went into effect in January of this year, I believe the date was actually January 17th, we saw a big jump in adoption of DevOps Change Velocity and DPR, but mostly in DevOps Change Velocity because it's been around for a while. So we know customers have been preparing for that day for quite some time, right? Because a lot of there's just a big jump in January of this year. And that really got our attention, saying, hey, this is something that we should really make sure other customers are aware of because it can help with these regulations. And that's what we're going to focus on now. Okay. Now, so key DORA regulatory policies. Okay. I mentioned that the oversight of third parties is a big part of it. There's also the part of it about mandating incident reporting. This is something that people have been using ServiceNow for since the beginning of time. So we're not going to really cover that so much. But the other aspect is continuous testing with evidence of test execution and outcomes. Okay. And it really emphasizes accountability and also promotes information sharing. So not just if you test something and the outcome is successful, but even when it's not successful, or even when you find the vulnerability or you find something that's wrong, it's really it's really an expectation that you share information about this vulnerability with the appropriate people so that other folks can take action as well. And this is a big part of what the DORA regulation is about. We are going to focus on the continuous testing with evidence and test execution outcomes here. That's a line item within DORA that I think we can really help with our policy enforcement. Okay. So that's what we're going to demo. And what I'll do is first I'll show you how we do it in DevOps Change Velocity, how we've been doing it for years in DevOps Change Velocity. And then I'll show you how if you adopt digital product release, you can start shifting some of those policies over into the release process. And then for the grand finale, I can show you how the policy engine that we use in digital product release, you'll be able to actually basically uplift the visibility of those policies into IRM and show within an IRM like control objective, for example, or what policies are compliant and which ones are not as they relate to that control objective. Okay. So before I get started, any more questions before I jump into the demo here?
Yes. One's from Brian. He's asking if there's a significant drawback to using change requests for lower environment deployments or releases. Or should they just use the service CI as the appropriate environment?
Yeah, I would say if you're automating the creation of change records, then there really isn't a drawback. And in fact, we are seeing a lot more customers use change records in low environments because it's really just automated record keeping, especially if you have DevOps Change Velocity implemented. The original ITIL specifications did not require change records for low environments, only for production environments. But we're seeing it's a very valuable thing to have a record of what's deployed where in each environment, and the change records a mechanism for doing that. Yeah.
Two other questions. One's from Tom. Our organization has an internally created CI/CD pipeline currently integrated with Change. Does DPR give an API to integrate better with ServiceNow outside of those noted platforms on the slide that we showed?
So if you are integrating with Change, and if you've taken the route where you're using the DevOps data model to do that, then it's already integrated with DPR because we do leverage the same data model in digital product release that as we do in DevOps Change Velocity. It's the same connection to the tool. One connection to ADO will give you all of that, for example. One connection to GitHub will give you all of that. But if you created your own and you've leveraged the data model that we provide, then it's already integrated with DPR.
Last one from Chris. What is the downside of using change tickets to track release activities as evidence? For example, application code change ticket type with a different workflow.
So let's say you're using a change record to make sure that everybody ran a security scan and you find out somebody didn't on a particular artifact you're deploying. So what has to happen at that point is you have to go back and actually rebuild that artifact and then rerun the test again. You have to start over. Whereas if you shift that activity further left, you can ensure that it took place before the end of that phase of a release, right? So that product, the timeline of that product wouldn't be impacted. So really, that's the main advantage is that you're not waiting to the absolute last minute to just check all the boxes. And I agree that most of the time that's done in the pipeline anyway. So it's really just compliance recording. But if you are using it as an enforcement mechanism to keep bad code or untested code out of production, we want to see that shifted left so it can be discovered earlier if something's wrong. Yeah.
All right, I think you can go forward with the demo.
All right, so let's talk about DevOps Change Velocity. I'm going to bring up the application record in SN. It's called the DevOps change application. And what this is, and is a it's really just a resource that we tie in all the discovered resources to a business application in ServiceNow. So in this case, it's all tied back to Globex Web. We have various pipelines. We have some various plans, including SPM and Jira. And then we also have some Git repositories. And all of these are tied back to our business app. Now, I'm specifically going to focus on this one pipeline here. This pipeline will build and test and deploy the application. And let's bring up the pipeline view. And I'm going to show you what we do is actually as things are happening. So if you're in Jira, you're creating work items, and then you start building code or you're writing code against those work items. You commit the code and you start building artifacts. And that's all happening. And even before the pipeline kicks off, we have the work items, we have the commit records, right? We have the test results and so on happening at every stage of that pipeline. We're collecting data, basically. All right. The quality scan, right, from Sonar Cube, you're going to see the results of that here. That's a lot of, valuable data. All of this data is linked to the change, is linked to the specific artifact we're deploying. And then when we eventually deploy that artifact, as you see in this pipeline here, we're going to create that change record, and it took place just before production. Now, here's the thing. If this change record can be approved automatically, then that will go right to production very quickly. And, the pipeline would pause only for a few seconds to get that approval, because in an automated way, we will have applied change policies. You see here, this particular change, we applied change approval policy B. So there are several different change policies for different scenarios. The scenario that fit based on some criteria, maybe, what type of application it is. Is it regulated a certain way? Does it have customer data in it? Is it in a certain geographical region? That we apply change approval policy B. Now, the change approval policy will list out various input variables, so different data points we're going to take. And usually it's like a combination of dev, sec, ops data points. So operational stability, like are there any outages in the last 7 days? Are there any incidents open, and so on? That will figure its way into the decision table. But we also want to look at security scans and vulnerabilities. This is what the example I was giving you. This is actually a very much an overloaded change. We've demoed DevOps Change Velocity this way for years, but I think going forward, we're going to start making sure that the policies we include in DevOps Change, and this is what those policies look like in the decision table. And we give a lot of these out of the box. We provide them, we make them available to you from the DevOps data model out of the box. In fact, if you were to go into the change approval process guide here, and you switch to the change models and the policies, you will see a list of all the different inputs that are available to you. And many of them are actually inputs that today we would consider should be done in the release process. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but this is what it looks like in DevOps Change Velocity. And these are the things that would be required before you were to get an approval of that change. In this case, the change was manually approved. We didn't meet the criteria, so somebody had to approve it, and that's all detailed here in the change record itself. Okay, this is a change that would actually be enforced by keeping that pipeline, holding that pipeline until the approval is received. You could also reject, you could also automatically reject a change. So there are, 3 possible outcomes, right? If it's high risk, we'll reject the change. If all the policies are met, we'll approve a change. If neither of those conditions are met, and this is what happened here, is we escalate for a manual review. So this is DevOps Change Velocity, and this is how change approvals are enforced, okay? So now, let's talk about digital product release, because it's a little different. And now if we're looking at, for example, those DORA test regulations, right, that we were just talking about a minute ago, you can see that a lot of these policies will actually include that. If we look at percentage of test results passing, or error budget remaining is more of an ITOM number, but let's see, security vulnerabilities, that's clearly something that would apply to your DORA compliance and so on. But let's look at now how we can do this in digital product release. Okay. So when you create a release template for different teams to use, this is where you actually set the process. This is where you actually will decide that every team that's using that template will actually have to have certain tasks and certain policies at each phase of a release. Now, if what you see here, and I'll show you in the template, and then I'll show you the execution of one of the releases. So you can dictate that every release during the planning phase, you have a stakeholder approval sign off, right? And then that would go to an approval definition where we decide who has to do that. Okay. Same thing during the development stage, you'll have certain tasks that have to be completed. Now, the tasks are mostly manual, but the policies are automated. That means these are automated queries that will run against the data that you have. So, for example, software quality compliance will run against the test results that come from your pipeline. So we already have that data. I demonstrated that in DevOps Change. Remember, it's the same data model, so we can run the query and see if the software quality test is compliant. And let's show you how that plays out in an actual release. I'm going to go to and bring up a release here. And this is the execution of that template. So there are other webinars we've done previously where we drill into the capabilities of DPR in detail, but today we're specifically talking about policies. So I'm just going to focus on that. So if we look at the execution of this release, we can see what phase we're in, what tasks have been completed. So if I go to the planning phase, I see, okay, all the tasks were completed in the planning phase. Development phase, I can see what tasks were completed, which ones weren't. And I could also see the results of policies. So these are policies that get executed, okay? Very important. These policies are executed when things run in those pipelines, okay? They're not executed when they run. The data that supports the policies are coming from the pipelines. They're actually executed on a fixed interval. We run them basically once a day at a certain time. Out of the box, you can tune that to execute these policies more frequently. But basically, what we're trying to do is accumulate data on this specific version of this product so that we can prove, right? We have the evidence to prove that we've met the criteria. Okay. And something weird is happening to my mouse here. I'm going to turn this off here and then use the one on the laptop. Okay, so now we have if we look at the data as things are executing, for example, builds are being created, we can see we have some vulnerabilities that were found. We have the results of unit testing. If you have functional testing and performance testing results, they're going to show up here. That's all going to be part of this release, and we can track it here. So if I know that a product went through this release process, and I have the data attached and I have the release then available when I deploy the change. And I'll show you what I mean by that. We can then understand that this testing was complete. Okay. And that becomes part of the record and that becomes traceable all the way through to deployment. Okay. So if we look at policies, and this is a policy here, like software quality compliance is directly tied to the regulatory requirement that we test software before it goes into production. And I'm going to show you how this works. I'm going to bring up a pipeline here, and we're going to see that pipeline. And this is a GitHub Actions pipeline. I'm going to go ahead and build a new version of this, version of this product. Okay. Now that's going to be build 268 ran earlier. I'm going to build 269. Thing about build 268, it was compliant, okay, but maybe some new code was added, and build number 269, we're going to show that in this case, we found a problem and it's no longer going to be compliant, and that'll take a minute. Any questions while we wait for that build to complete?
One question from Brian around DCV. He's asking, for DevOps changes, is there an example of how to determine low risk, high frequency versus other DevOps and cloud changes? So I think looking at maybe risk there, how do you determine what levels of change use what level of DevOps? I think.
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you look at a lot of the DevOps work that's been done on determining risk. So with change management, we have risk that's based on how many customers are impacted or how complex is the change. And complexity of a change could be how many CIs are impacted or how many people have to sign off on the various aspects of it. That's on the ServiceNow change side. But if you look at the development side, they also have specific numbers to look at to determine risk. And you can go into there are books written about this on like Accelerate, the book by Nicole Forsgren. She was part of the original Dora team that wrote that created basically the DevOps metrics for measuring. They look at things like how many lines of code have changed, right? Because we want to keep DevOps changes small and incremental. You could also look at things of how many commits before you merge. Because if you have too many commits, and those are code changes that you have to merge back into a master branch, the complexity of that merge could indicate risk. Okay. So there are specific numbers coming from both the operation side and the development side that you can use to determine risk. And we still, there are probably 3 or 4 different ways to do that in ServiceNow change management. You have the interview, you have the form that folks can fill out, but now a lot of this data is available in an automated way, so that could be used in the risk calculation table. And then, of course, you have AI, right? And agentic AI can look at things like even the code change and determine if that change is something that should be that's more risky than another type of change. Yeah. Okay, so the build completed, build number 269. And just to show you, this build now has a failed test result. It went from 12 tests to 13 tests, and one of them fails. And then if I go ahead and run the policies again, that policy is going to reflect the results of that actual test that took place. Okay, so that's really close to real time tracking of things happening in those development tools by those developers. Okay, so the policy ran. I'm going to refresh this. And if we scroll down to see software quality compliance, it shows 13 tests, 1 failed, only a 92% passing rate. That's not enough to get to compliance. So it shows non-compliance. Okay, so that's how we can take something that's tracked, how we can enforce it in the release process itself. Okay, because we can say, okay, if it's not compliant, then we can hold up the deployment of this release. We won't get to the deployment phase until all of the policies are compliant. Now, bigger picture, there's folks on the governance side, in the compliance side that are looking at this. And if you're using GRC, these policies can actually roll up to higher level authority documents in the form of control objectives. And what do I mean by that? So you might have like a DORA or ISO 27000 or a security privacy controls you see here. All of these will have various control objectives associated with those, right? So if I look at the control objective here, we have one that says test all software. Let me find that one. And test all software changes before implementation in production. Because we're using the policy as code engine, okay? And again, there are other webinars where we dive deeper into the policy as code engine. That policy as code engine, even before we utilized it for digital product release, has an existing integration with IRM, with GRC for compliance, right? So if I look at this control objective, I can take policies specifically from DPR and map them to this to this objective. And anywhere that policy shows up, it's going to create a control, a specific control. And you see there's 897 of them, a specific control for that release. And we can then track compliance in specific versions wherever it exists, right? Because that policy might exist in multiple versions or multiple releases, and we're going to be able to track it and map it back to a specific version and whether it's compliant or not. And that could make its way into the overall here you see, there's a percentage of overall of all the indicators rolling up to the IRM. So this is all automated. We don't have to ask developers to attest to a security scan or attest to the penetration test. Those attestations can be replaced by this process, by the integration with IRM, because the data are all available to us, and it rolls up to the compliance of a specific control objective. The other capability we have in digital product release, and I'm going to show you, is the ability to request exceptions. Okay, this is a capability that this integration will be exposed in DPR in the November release. And remember, this is all under safe harbor notice, so that could change, right? But if it doesn't change, then in November release, you'll be able to map these policies up to your IRM control objectives and also request exceptions. So that means, and if I drill into any one of these, maybe that specific one there, I can say, okay, this one's non-compliant now. I know that last test is actually a problem. It's not actually working correctly. So I'm going to request an exception. I could go into like that mapping of that software quality. And where was it? It was version 8.0. I think it was this one here. And I can request exception. I can give it a justification. Test is faulty. And then this kicks off a workflow. This will kick off a workflow in IRM, right? So this will be a compliance workflow where somebody will have to approve this exception. That will allow, if the exception is approved, that will allow the release policy to show as we have an actual state that's approved with exception, but it will allow the release to continue even if the policy is showing that it's not complete, it's not compliant, but it's compliant with exception, and that's good enough. And there's an audit of who approved it, why it was requested, and so on. So that's all going to be available to you in the November release of DPR. Okay, and I believe that's all we have to show on the demo side. Do we have any questions before I hand it back for us to wrap up?
Yeah. One from Linda, and I'll extend the question. She's asking, can DevOps be used for ServiceNow enhancements, development work with update sets? You think you can just answer that for both DevOps and DPR? Can they be used for ServiceNow enhancements development work?
Yeah, so DevOps change velocity really depends on having a pipeline in place. So if you're using a pipeline like Jenkins, and there is a plugin, right? There are plugins for CI/CD plugins for Jenkins and for ADO, and there's APIs associated with that on the ServiceNow side for moving update sets from one instance to another. So that has to be in place first. You have to be taking advantage of like a pipeline tool. Once you have that in place, we integrate with those pipeline tools from DevOps Change Velocity, and then you can do everything I just showed you to support, moving update sets between ServiceNow instances.
Last question that we have is from Randy. I'm not sure I fully understand how it's written. How it's written is there a way to create a product record in DPR as a software model of record is created? So maybe we can speak to like the different types of like releases that we support in DPR.
Yeah, so the products we create, and out of the box, when you install DPR, you'll see all your business apps represented as products. So there is a one-to-one relationship. You create a product, it creates a business app. There's also a job you could run. The name of the job escapes me, but it's available for you to actually create products. And I think what you were alluding to was the CMDB application product model. This is a table that's existed in ServiceNow, predates DPR. You use it in software asset management. The same place you're tracking like usage of SAP or PeopleSoft and software asset management, that's a product model, right? And whether you develop it in-house using like a third party, creating a homegrown application, that also goes into that same table. So yeah, there are ways to create them from your business apps, or every time you create one here, it will, create a record in that table. I hope that answers the question. Yeah. Now, also, as of the last release of DPR, we also support service models. So now, not just application models, but service models that are tied to like application services and technology services in the CMDB. So that's very important because we have a lot of customers, especially those that are migrating from RM-v2 that did a very traditional IT service transition type of release where you're not really tracking like Jira work items and in your scope, you're tracking things like you're tracking things like catalog requests and problems that are being resolved in the scope. And so those capabilities is there as well. You can map any task table to the scope of a release. So you can very easily, if you're doing this as an RM-v2, which we have deprecated, so you will have to decide if you want to stay on it as a custom solution that you support, or if you want to move to DPR where there's far more capabilities, you can, carry out that use case of tracking demands, requests, any task against the release scope. Yeah. Any other questions?
There's a few that came in. I think this is a good one. Could you give us more examples of when a digital product or DPR would be used for a service release?
Yeah, I think we just talked about that. So the difference with a service release as opposed to a product release is one, the scope, right? So product enhancements are really more about resolving issues with the service, adding new capabilities to the service, fulfilling catalog requests with a new version of the service. The other big difference is usually the versioning of a service is not tied to like a semantic version number, right? It's services are upgraded every month or deployed every month, new updates, and then you get you might have like a quarterly update or the version is actually the month it's deployed. You're not you're not as specific about using the using specific versions of products for the service. So the release is tied to like the quarter that it's being released and so on. Those are just some examples. Yeah. Another question? I see Bryant Lund.
This is another good question. Where does server patching fall under the realm of DPR? This is pretty relevant to our roadmap. If you want to talk about
It's a
major
good question.
change.
So you can handle server patching with DPR. There are some new capabilities that are becoming available pretty soon. So in the next release of DPR, well, let me first show you. When you create templates, you can create like a stage-oriented template or an emergency template or a patch template that's very specific to the patching process, right? And the big difference between stage and timeline-oriented releases is that we want to make sure with a stage-oriented release, everything gets done in a certain order, and we don't really concern ourselves with the timeline. We just want to make sure things get done and each phase completes when the phase is done, whereas in the timeline, it's more about tracking the beginning, making sure that the phase begins on a certain schedule, right? So typically a patch release will be a stage-oriented release, and you'll have a template specific for that. The big capabilities we're adding in a release is the ability to track individual CIs. Okay, so we're calling it complex rollouts. So in DPR, you're going to have a complex rollout. So the release you'll be able to track the rollout against specific CI. So you'll have, let's say 100 servers you're deploying a patch to. You'll be able to list them all as a server type, and every single one of them you'll be able to track individually of whether the patch was applied. And the updating of that mechanism will come from your tools, your patch tools, but that's where it's going to be visualized in DPR as a impacted configuration item. Also, change management to coincide with that are adding what's called a major change, where you'll have one change record that could also be applied to like hundreds of CIs, and you'll be able to track the application of that to all of those CIs. So this is all, we're starting in August. When the August release, we're going to be tying releases to specific CIs, and then the major change capability will further enhance that to track what we call complex rollouts, or taking the same version of a product and deploying it to many places. Today, you can do that with change records, right? You can have a whole list of change records. You could group them, you could track them. But if you're not automating this, these change records become overwhelming and become too difficult to manage. And if you had to approve a whole bunch of changes because you're deploying the same version to, the multiple CIs, that could be a lot of administrative overhead. Yeah. Any more?
There are a few more. We can maybe take one more and then we gotta close this
I think we got to
out.
wrap up. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Let's see which is a good one here. Do you have any companies that participate in testing these updates for change requests using DPR like server patching? Do we have any customers using it for like that server patching use case today? Have you talked to any, Joe?
We have customers that are requesting that capability.
Requesting it, yeah, I would
Yeah, yeah.
say.
That's because we don't really do it today. Like I said, you can track lots and lots of changes and relate them back to a version of a product, and they will show up here. And technically, each one of these changes represents a different server, or I mean, in this case, it's a different version of the product for different servers. But again, we can do that today with a very cumbersome list of changes, but we're gonna clean that up to make it easier and much more fit for purpose. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, Caitlin, I guess I'll hand it back over to you to wrap up.
Yeah. Thanks, Joe. So for the few questions that we didn't have the chance to answer live, we'll try to get back to you on those separately. There's only a few, so we'll get to those. But to close today's session out, we do have a quick call to action slide here. One, if you're more interested in webinars like this, we have numerous. We have a DPR Launch and Learn, as well as a Modern Change Launch and Learn that goes into specific topics about how those products work and what are the key capabilities in them. Also, I mean, you're here on the Modern Change Academy series, but if you haven't joined our previous ones, we've been running this session for almost a year at this point. We have a lot of past sessions on different focus topics like this. Please go ahead and look at those. If you're interested in starting on your modern change journey, we did recently publish just last month our adoption playbook on community. This is a pretty in-depth prescriptive guidance on our maturity recommendations or adoption journey for modern change, which cuts across change, DevOps change velocity, as well as digital product release, as well as guidance on kind of how to do that, at least for the first part. We're still working on building it out fully, but we'd love to see any feedback you have on that. So far, the reception's been pretty positive. And then after that, it's just if you want to engage with us more broadly, our forums are pretty active, both for change and DPR. So please ask any questions you have there. We have a good community that'll help support you. Okay, we're just at time. I would love to thank everybody for joining today. Thank you, Joe, for going through that demo, and hope you
Thank
have a great
you.
rest of your Thursday. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.